Your four favorites are Pan's Labyrinth, The Sound of Music, Life is Beautiful, and The Simpsons movie. My top choice for you is Kubo and the Two Strings. It's an animated film like The Simpsons movie, a dark fantasy like Pan's Labyrinth. It's about music like The Sound of Music, and about family like Life is Beautiful. Another one of my top choices is Labyrinth. Like Pan's Labyrinth, it's a fantasy involving a girl, a labyrinth, magic, and a variety of creatures. Like The Sound of Music, it's a musical. Like Life is Beautiful, it involves someone trying to protect their family. And there's a scene in the Simpsons movie that seems like it was inspired by it. It's a Wonderful Life, like Life is Beautiful, is the type of film that gives viewers a feeling of hope even when things are bleak. It's a fantasy like Pan's Labyrinth, and it's about family like The Sound of Music, and community like the Simpsons movie. I think you'd enjoy Big Fish because it's a fantasy that feels inspired by fairy tales like Pan's Labyrinth, but it doesn't have that darkness to it like Pan's Labyrinth. In fact, it has a vibrant and joyous energy like The Sound of Music. Like Life is Beautiful, it's about the stories a father tells his son, because in this film, the dad shares all these stories that sound like fantasies, and in Life is Beautiful, the father tries to convince his son that the concentration camp is a game. Piggybacking off of that concept in Life is Beautiful, I want to recommend another film where someone is lying to their loved one to try and protect them, and that's Goodbye Lenin, which similarly blends together tragedy and comedy, and I think the tone of this one would fit in well with your favorites. The Fall similarly involves making up stories as a way to help or shield someone from reality, and like Pan's Labyrinth, it depicts a young girl escaping into a world of fantasy. Speaking of movies that involve telling stories, I also think you'd enjoy The Princess Bride, which is a fantasy that feels like it was inspired by fairy tales like Pan's Labyrinth, but it's also a comedy like The Simpsons movie. Three of your favorites take place during wars, and two of those specifically involve Nazis, which might be a coincidence, but you didn't have Schindler's List marked as watched, and I think it's worth checking out. But I don't think it quite matches the tone of your favorites because it's a lot heavier, so I want to balance things out by also recommending To Be or Not to Be, which is a black comedy set in Nazi-occupied Poland. While I'm on the topic of movies set against a backdrop of war, I also want to recommend Howl's Moving Castle, which is also an animated film like The Simpsons movie and a fantasy like Pan's Labyrinth. Speaking of animated films, another one I want to recommend is Alice in Wonderland, which feels like it had an influence on Pan's Labyrinth. Enchanted is a musical like The Sound of Music, a fairy tale-inspired fantasy film like Pan's Labyrinth, and a comedy like The Simpsons movie, and it's also partially animated. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory depicts a child entering a fantastical world like Pan's Labyrinth. It's a musical like The Sound of Music, and it has some absurd humor like The Simpsons movie. A Monster Calls, like Pan's Labyrinth, is a dark fantasy film where the protagonist is a child, and like Life is Beautiful, it depicts people grappling with tragic circumstances. Moulin Rouge is a musical like The Sound of Music. At times, it has a bit of humor and chaotic energy to it like The Simpsons movie, but it's also about love and tragedy like Life is Beautiful. Guillermo del Toro said Pan's Labyrinth is an informal sequel to The Devil's Backbone because of their thematic similarities, and some of the actors in this film had cameos in Pan's Labyrinth. The Spirit of the Beehive seems like it heavily inspired Pan's Labyrinth. Del Toro cited it as one of his favorite films about childhood, and both films also incorporate elements of fantasy. But if you're going to watch it, I recommend checking out Frankenstein first because it's an integral part of the plot. Another film that came to mind when I was thinking of Pan's Labyrinth is The Night of the Hunter, which is another movie Del Toro said was one of his favorites about childhood. And even though this one isn't a fantasy like Pan's Labyrinth, it has that looming sense of danger. Since you're a fan of The Sound of Music, another classic musical I think you'd enjoy is Singin' in the Rain. Seeing The Sound of Music and The Simpsons movie in the same four favorites makes me want to recommend Walk Hard, the Dewey Cox story, because it's about music and I think the humor is comparable to The Simpsons movie.